안녕하십니까? 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분,
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. And this session will deal with the challenges of American journalists facing in covering foreign countries for American audiences. And if you need translation, please turn to channel 1 for Korean, channel 2 for English. Now, I would like to introduce you to the moderator. Moderator is President Raymond Buckwart of Pacific Century Institute.
Welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for Challenges American Journalists Face in Covering Foreign Countries for American Audiences. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to Ambassador Raymond Burkhart, President of the Pacific Century Institute, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome Ambassador Burkhart.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you. Pleasure for me to be back here in Korea. I'm a former diplomat, and I was here for 3.5 years in the 90s, and it's always wonderful to be in Korea. I'm here with 6 American journalists, and on a program that we've been doing almost every year. I started it when I was at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and it's supported by the Pacific Century Institute and by the Korea Press Foundation, as well as by the East-West Center. And we bring 6 American journalists, or that number, or maybe sometimes more or less, to Korea, and 6 Koreans to America. And then after their trips, they meet together in Honolulu to compare impressions. And the subject this year is looking at challenges, foreign policy challenges of the new administration here in Korea. These are all highly experienced journalists. Some of them have worked overseas, others have not, but they all are at the height of their careers. And I'm going to we're going to look today at this issue broadly of reporting about other countries to America and the sort of special challenges that exist for that because of the nature of our society and the kind of expectations that American viewers and readers have. Just to be clear, we're not just going to be talking about reporting on geostrategic issues. We're going to be there, but the whole range of overseas issues: business, sports, cultural trends, etc. So let me begin. I'm going to ask the journalists to introduce themselves. Why don't we go from left to right here, Catherine?
Hi. Thank you all for being here. My name is Kathleen Kingsbury. I oversee the opinion operation at the New York Times. That includes our columnists, our editorial board, which is the institutional voice of the New York Times, as well as guest essays and letters to the editor. As background, I came to the Times in 2017 from the Boston Globe. Before that, I worked for Time magazine as a foreign correspondent based in Hong Kong. I covered the region of Asia. I was the Asia correspondent, so essentially Korea to Australia, and then India to the Philippines. And I also lived in Shanghai, so I am very excited to be back in Asia and to be on this trip and for this panel. And I'll pass it on to Bill.
Hello, my name is Bill Hennigan. I cover national security for Time magazine. I've covered national security for about 15 years. Before that, I covered I was at the Los Angeles Times, and I was their Pentagon correspondent. I also worked out of Los Angeles, where I cover the aerospace and defense industry. So yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Farrell, and I'm on the investigative team at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in Wisconsin, which is in the north center of the U.S. This is my first time in Asia. I primarily do do deeper dives on more domestic regional issues. Prior to coming to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, I've worked my whole career in local news. I was in North Carolina reporting on local government there, and I've also covered the energy industry in Pittsburgh.
Hello, my name is Emily Lunds. I'm a senior writer at CNN International, where I've worked for 16 years now. And I write short-form journalism for the teleprompter for our presenters. And we cover the news of the day. We do a lot on the Koreas. We have been covering the royal family and the death of the Queen a lot lately. That's what I was doing right until I left for this trip. And we give a lot of coverage to the war in Ukraine. These things have been my focus in recent weeks and months. And I worked in local news before I came to CNN at 3 affiliates in Fresno, California, Phoenix, Arizona, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's my first time in Korea, and I'm extremely excited to be here, so thank you for having us.
Hi, everyone. My name's Brittany Tom, and I'm a field producer at NBC News Dateline, which is NBC's long-form investigative criminal long-form program. I've covered a lot of issues related to the criminal courts in the U.S. I covered the Elizabeth Holmes case recently. I've done stories on prison reform. I also did a long series on homelessness in Los Angeles. Prior to that, I was a producer at Al Jazeera America and helped launch that network in the U.S. And then even before that, I did work in Beijing very briefly for NBC News. It's also my first time to Korea, and I'm really excited to be here. And thank you so much for inviting us to be on this panel.
I'm Kevin Nodell. I'm a reporter at the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. I focus mostly on military and diplomatic issues as they relate to Hawaii and to the broader Pacific. Previous to going to Hawaii, I was a freelance reporter for several years, worked in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and the UAE briefly. First time in Korea for myself as well. Happy to be here.
Thank you, all of you. Great. Why don't we launch into the topic briefly before we open it up to everybody here. Could each of you give me some of your thoughts about this subject of the challenges of reporting about foreign issues to Americans? Maybe if you touch on it now or perhaps later to keep it in your mind. People often talk about how Americans are isolationists or have a whole history of isolationism. There's some truth to that, but I think it's a lot less true now than it was 40 years ago. But it is perhaps still a factor which you have to deal with when you're thinking about what is going to grab this American audience, what's going to make them read it or watch it or listen to it. So why don't we go the other direction? Why don't we start with you?
Oh, great. Well, I think one challenge that I've found, though I also want to say that there's sometimes a difference between what American audiences aren't interested in and what editors insist they won't be interested in, and maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But one challenge I've definitely found—
That can't possibly be true.
Of course not. But I think one challenge with American audiences, whether it be the general public or when it comes to policymakers, is a propensity for what kids today are sometimes calling main character syndrome, whereas America sometimes look at issues abroad and they either write it off as something that has nothing to do with them, or they look at it and lock into it immediately and see it as about them. And for instance, if we're going to talk about Korea, there's a lot of things that happen on the Korean Peninsula, huge trade and security partner with the United States, so inherently a lot of these things involve the United States, but that doesn't mean that the people involved are going to be looking at it through the lens of, oh, how is this going to affect America, or they're being motivated by American interests. People are motivated by their own interests, and Americans, I think, sometimes struggle to grasp that.
For me, actually, I would like to focus on an issue that's directly in U.S. newsrooms, which is the lack of diversity among the journalists in newsrooms. As you know, the U.S. is a country that's very multicultural, but the number of people of color in a newsroom is underrepresented, and that actually, I think, contributes to the types of coverage that we have across international news. There can be implicit or explicit bias in terms of the language used when covering international news. The the types of stories that are covered. Also the cultural sensitivity. As a person of color myself, I'm Chinese American. I've oftentimes been one of the few people of color in the newsroom, and I know different stories do not get bought or other people are interested in, and I think that is a result of the lack of diversity in U.S. newsrooms. So that's an issue I would like to bring up in today's panel.
There is also an extreme lack of geographical awareness. We should all know how to use Google Maps, and we probably all can, but that doesn't mean Americans do. And I think the fact that a lot of Americans don't know where these events are happening is part of the problem. A 2019 study from the Council on Foreign Relations found that less than half of Americans can find Afghanistan on a map. And that is, of course, the location of America's longest ever war. So
Didn't Mark Twain say God invented war so Americans would discover geography?
yeah. And that's, I mean, how to fix that, I don't know. It would go back to the educational system, but that's part of the problem.
So I think there are a lot of factors at play. I guess to give Americans a bit of credit, I do think that, you know, the country is really big and there's a lot going on. And so I do think that, while Americans consume a lot of cultural, cultural topics, and they know about particularly cultural issues as it pertains to South Korea, I think that the cratering of local news has played a big role, and I think in order to really understand why Americans might not be as receptive or read international news, it's important to understand that, you know, on a domestic level, even within various states, there has been a huge decline and decrease in the amount of reporters and newspapers covering news in their area. I think it makes a big difference for Americans also when they see reporters who live in their own states and in their own communities go abroad. You know, years ago, major regional papers like the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Chicago Tribune had people who would travel overseas and, you know, be in Europe, be in Asia, cover major conflicts and bring, you know, write about that and connect those issues to their own communities. I had the opportunity earlier this year to go to the Poland-Ukraine border and cover the war there, the refugee crisis with USA Today, and it was really interesting to see just, I think, you know, people being really interested and engaged and understanding like what I saw, because I'm like the only person they knew from Wisconsin that had the opportunity to see that firsthand. And so I think that it's really important to just understand that, you know, it's difficult at times for a lot of Americans to really, I think, get robust news about their own states and communities, and that sort of trickles down to the national level or the international level.
I think I see this a little differently. As my job is a storyteller, you know, and I have to find people and stories that connect with people on a human level. And I think that exists no matter where you go. So, you know, that's my responsibility. I've gone and covered conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, my job when I go there, you know, is to report the news, of course, but I also need to find a narrative that people will relate to and that it will bring that to be real for them, rather than something that's happening on their television screens. You know, I think that reporters need to be cognizant of that whenever they're going abroad. Is that, you know, you're looking for that kernel, that seed that can connect with people in a way that, you know, from 30,000 foot, the policy discussions and the politics behind it are not going to do.
Yeah, I think making that connection for the American reader is really, really important when you're covering international events. You know, you saw that with the Ukraine war outbreak. We were talking about this the other day, which is, I think that a lot of people didn't realize that Russia was such an enormous source of energy resources for so much of Europe, but there are bigger consequences to the United States in terms of inflation, so many different things. And now, of course, the United States is aiding Ukraine with our taxpayer dollars. Obviously, I agree with that decision, but it is a major investment by the United States in Ukraine. And so whatever you can do to make sure that a war doesn't feel like it's something far away, but in fact actually does touch people's lives in the United States, I think that's a really, really important job for journalists in general. You know, in the opinion context, we have a slightly different challenge, which is particularly the New York Times has always played a role as, frankly, fostering public diplomacy. We frequently have head of states who want to write for our section, who, you know, right after Biden's election, we had a very senior member of the Chinese government who wrote a piece for us, essentially laying out the terms of China's engagement with the Biden administration and how to do that, but also do it in a way that is fact-based, that is not essentially lending your voice to propaganda or lending your report to propaganda. Those are kind of the questions of the 21st century, whereas I think that that was a little bit of a different, they had a different approach, you know, when it was just a print newspaper. So we've had, I would say that's one of our biggest challenges, is making a determination of whose voice is in the New York Times opinion section, whose opinions deserve to be in our section, and how we think about continuing that role of being, you know, fostering public diplomacy when there are increasingly, frankly, stakes that are higher than ever before.
Terrific points, really great points. Every one of you made points that in many cases I would not have thought about exactly.
Please use the microphone.
Oh, sorry. My stentorian voice was not loud enough. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jung-in. Okay. No, just the terrific points. I mean, really great points. We could begin, if any of you wanted to sort of comment or amplify points that somebody else had made, we could start with that a little bit and then turn to the audience.
Yeah, I want to actually just weigh in on something that Caitlin mentioned. And not only do we have local papers that have shuttered their foreign bureaus, we don't actually have as many journalists who have the experience of being foreign correspondents anymore. And that is really, I think, you know, from my perspective as someone who did have that opportunity, who got to travel the world and tell people's stories, right now, you know, increasingly, with the exception of perhaps the Times, but and a few other places, the vast majority of foreign reporting comes from war zones. And one of the things that we've learned, particularly in the opinion section, is a great way to entice audiences to want to understand the rest of the world is to be very broad and expansive in your thinking about what kind of coverage you want to do. So, for instance, we did a piece about K-pop. It was a couple of years ago now. It was actually one of our most read pieces of 2019, both in the United States and abroad. And it was something that, you know, found interest that, you know, frankly, many of our pieces about Ukraine have not. And so I like to remind people that particularly when we can find people on the ground in countries, we have a beautiful writer who writes about Lebanon and Beirut who really brought to life the horrible situation there for us, for our readers. And I think people could relate to that because she was talking about food shortages, but she was doing it in such a way that talked about her family. And I think it was very easy to not, frankly, glaze over at the geostrategic points of that piece because she brought it to life with her own personal narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. That's what I was referencing before, which is, you know, you can describe the war in Ukraine, right? But if I describe, you know, an orphan who had lost their mother and father in an airstrike, that's a far more compelling narrative that you're going to want to follow than just, you know, the latest aid package or what have you. So, you know, that's our role, and of course, you know, the decimation of foreign. I mean, you know, Katie worked for Time Magazine, her job doesn't exist any longer.
Yeah.
You know, so not having those folks on the ground and having a reporter come in and parachute in, it's just not going to have the same sort of seasoning and attention to nuance that someone who's been living there. And it's easier for them to tease out those and find those stories to relate to our readers.
Anyone else? Or you want to turn to the questions from the audience? Anybody else, or should we just turn to questions from the audience?
No, I was just going to agree with Bill on that one, but I think one challenge that I've definitely found is, again, one of the challenges is you'll have an editor who will tell you nobody cares about that orphan. You know, stick to the things that Americans care about. And that's...
And I think it's important maybe to note too, just that like in general, relatively few Americans even hold a passport to travel abroad. And I do think that once someone has the opportunity to leave the country and have an experience outside of it, I mean, it really just revolutionizes, I mean, it did for me when I had the opportunity to leave the US. And I think, frankly, it's expensive to do so. The barrier to entry to become a foreign correspondent and even stay in journalism from a socioeconomic level, I mean, is quite high. Many students go to college, they're saddled with student debt, and then they, you know, enter a job market where they're paid very little, and it's difficult to pay your bills and pay off your student loans. And that's really, I think, the reality for many people trying to get into journalism right now. And so, anyway, to be able to go abroad and do that, really, for anyone, whether in journalism or not, can you know.
Brittany, you want?
Oh. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that sentiment, Caitlin. I feel like that was really well said. One thing I want to bring up, though, too, is that like we all talk about, oh, like these stories, Americans aren't interested in these stories, it's hard to get that bought. But what responsibility do you think we have in like giving people these stories, and it's like giving them the broccoli, like forcing them to be interested in it versus like adhering to what our audiences want? Because if we keep doing that, it's leading to this lack of stories around the world, lack of cultural awareness. So it's kind of that fine balance, what the audience wants and what our editors and our senior producers are telling us to cover.
And when it comes to a shortage of international news, it's what came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean,
Right.
Do we not offer more because we think they don't want it, or do they not want it because we don't offer enough?
Mm-hmm. I think it's also just a slight misnomer to think that they don't want it. I mean, you know, the Times is a global newspaper, of course. We think of ourselves as a global news organization.
I've never heard of it.
No. We find a lot of audience, particularly, I mean, for sure, our biggest story of the year is the Ukraine war. I mean, by far, you know, and I think that the other thing to know about that is that we've made an enormous investment in reporting from Ukraine, which is an enormous security risk, but we also are continuing to cover the rest of the globe at the same time. And, you know, I think that obviously we're in a unique situation at the Times in comparison to other news organizations, which have all suffered a lot of financial stress, but we haven't not seen interest for that investment. Mm-hmm.
There are ways to measure it, though, that sometimes do show a lack of interest. I mean, if we air an international story on CNN International and we can see the ratings and we can see that people are changing the channel, that can influence decisions on how much coverage we get.
Fair enough.
But the same, I would think, applies to print with clicks, and you can figure out which are the most read stories. Yeah. And I also agree that I don't think there's inherently a lack of interest. It's just trying to gauge the interest that's truly difficult sometimes.
Speaking from Hawaii, I can definitely say that we have a very international population in many ways. I won't get into the last organization I worked in there, but my current organization understands that very well, that we have, you know, a large Filipino population that cares very deeply about American policy implications in the Philippines. We have a large Japanese American population that's pretty invested in that. We have a not huge Korean American population in Honolulu, but not a small one either, and they definitely care. And also most of us care because we're in the splash zone for missile policy, so we do care about that.
And I thought you brought up an interesting point earlier, which is this whole like Americans only care about themselves. Like, how does this relate to America? How, like, what, you know?
Well, I don't think all Americans are like that, but I do think there's a swath of vocal people, a lot of the people who dominate the conversation do. A lot of the policy experts that we are often told that we need to interview talk that way, and sometimes our editors do.
No, and I wasn't saying, I think that sentiment, though, can be found in our American populace, but yeah, I guess what responsibility do we have in, you know, not covering the news because our audience isn't interested, or is there a social responsibility as a gatekeeper to actually provide this information to the public?
I'm going to give a couple of opportunities here. I see Caitlin, do you want to say something too? Yeah.
I was just going to note, I mean, this sort of like lends credence to the idea that Americans care to the extent that it intersects just with America. But that being said, I will say that one topic that really is, you know, comes to the forefront for folks, particularly in the Midwest as well, is when you see foreign business investment come. So like in Wisconsin a few years back, there was a major Taiwanese company, Foxconn, that there's the biggest subsidy for a foreign company in U.S. history was given to that company coming to southern Wisconsin. And so, you know, when those kinds of things happen, you know, that is able to obviously just draw a connection for local media, and many Americans have a lot of interest because, of course, it affects their communities, and whatever that company overseas is doing is affecting what's happening in their own backyard. So I will say that that's sort of a key point that I see where people become engaged because it's affecting them in the U.S.
William, did you have a point?
I'm going to steal your job for a second. When you were talking about, you know, the barriers to entry, about being a foreign correspondent, and, you know, the fact that a lot of these bureaus are being closed down, I mean, Kevin is the case in point of that. You know, he was a freelancer who went on his own to get into Syria to cover the conflict and took on financial and physical risk himself in order to tell those stories. So I just wanted to give you a chance to trot that out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that is a tremendous problem, and yeah, we're absolutely right on saying that we definitely. It's a real shame that we don't have those bureaus out of like the Seattle Times, or if I could work more internationally from the Star Advertiser out of Honolulu, I would really love that, but we don't quite have the budget to do that regularly. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of actual freelancers that are out there working today. They do incur quite a lot of risk, and this is not just Americans. There's a lot of international freelancers that I worked with. I crashed on a lot of couches to save money. I mean, that's kind of the reality of where we're getting a lot of our foreign coverage today. It is from people like that. Like Danny Gold, a name that I will highlight as somebody who works really hard. You know, there's a lot of really tremendous talent out there, so it's not as if these things have gone away, but they have become more dangerous because these are people who don't have insurance, they don't have organizations behind them. I was very fortunate. I was working in Iraq when the pandemic started. I was freelancing for Coffee or Die magazine, which some of you may have heard of, maybe not. Won't get into the long backstory on that, but they were gracious enough to actually put down the money to repatriate me when I got stranded there, and that is not something that a lot of organizations would do for a freelancer. It just simply is not.
I mean, when you saw the stories, sorry.
Questions?
No, I wanted to open it up to the audience.
Well, I just want to talk.
Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say this: the reporters that you've seen in danger with ISIS were not folks that worked for, you know, major publications. These were folks that were freelancers that took risk on their own to be there, found themselves in that situation, and then had no recourse, no one there to help them other than if you know, the federal government stepped in, and that, of course, sadly does not happen too often.
I'm glad this panel brought out that whole phenomenon, because I think very few people are aware of that, how important freelance journalism has become. Yeah. Let me open it up to the audience, please. I was going to go back to them. I'm going to go back to them at the end. I'm picking up on the questions. Yeah. Mr. Ambassador. I'll ask everyone to please also identify themselves. In this case, I was able to identify the ambassador of Israel. So.
Thank you very much. Look, I think this issue you're talking about is not an American issue. It's every country in the world. The Israeli press doesn't report about the Jewish world outside of Israel. The Korean press, you should see what they talk about the Blue House and the presidential office. They don't cover the rest of the world. This is everywhere in its human nature. I do think an issue that people talk about it in the American context because America is, say, the new Rome, or is, because American foreign policy is so important. But why should we assume that the American public should be different than the Dutch public or anyone else? But I have to say that when we see American media here on the cable channels as it's packaged here in Korea, it's, except for the New York Times, which comes as an insert, and that's terrific, but CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, it's a horrible, horrendous portrayal of the American democracy. I'm sorry to say it. It's not news. It's preaching. It's indoctrination. And I think it's a very, very negative education to the rest of the world about American democracy and American journalism is supposed to be. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think that's a reflection of the state of American democracy right now. I understand that you're critiquing the approach, but I also think the reality is, and I don't think I would be alone in this assessment. We've very rarely been at such a low point in terms of political division in the United States, and the future of American democracy is, frankly, unclear. And I think that everyone here knows about, the role that Fox News has played in that. And I think that, and I'm sure other cable outlets you could make the same critique of, but I think that what you're talking about is a reflection of the state of the country right now, in many ways.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I think one point on, why should the American people be any different in their ignorance of the rest of the world, I think I understand the point, and I don't entirely disagree with it, at least from a moral standpoint, but I think that comes back to our responsibility as journalists to make Americans care, because, like I said, a lot of stories around the world do involve Americans, whether they are engaged with it or not. Their taxpayers go into supporting various regimes or opposing various regimes, or sending weapons to various regimes, or any number of things. Americans are very inherently involved with the rest of the world, whether they know about it or not. And I think that Americans, because they pay for it, they have a responsibility to know to some degree, but it's also our job to remind them it's their responsibility, and it's our job to make sure that they're informed.
Caitlin?
I agree with Kevin, and I think, I think undoubtedly, of course, American democracy has challenges, to put it mildly. But and this is just my opinion, I think, ask every reporter is going to have their own opinion. But I think it's also important to note that, indeed, in the U.S., there is a major credibility crisis within the news media that I think it's important that our industry address. I think the reality is that the public doesn't really understand how the news is made, like how a print newsroom works, how that might be different from a local TV station or a cable network television station, how we reach the decisions we reach about what is published or how we publish. And I think, I'm really an advocate for more humility, I guess, in the industry, because I think that, we're fallible humans. I think we strive to always, do the best we can and be fair, but I think the reality is that, there's a lot of big challenges facing the media too, and that we become better when we acknowledge that and grow from it.
Well put.
Go ahead.
I'm tempted to push back a little bit on this whole issue, this whole sort of what's become a very popular cliche that American democracy is falling apart. And maybe we could go back to your question, Mr. Ambassador. What is it that you're seeing in those three, in some ways rather different stations, which creates this this ugly picture?
I can't keep it on the screen more than 10 seconds because I'm being told what to think, and almost force-fed, and it can be a left, a centrist, or a right, but it's being forced down your throat as with cheerleading, which frankly, it started with Fox, and then it spread to everyone else, just everyone in their own flavor. And it's all within the Beltway, and it's all extremely parochial. And I understand that Abraham Lincoln would be very unhappy right now. I get that. But I don't think the way to deal with it is for major cable news to join, this horrendous Hyde Parkism.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we've found out through the course of this, for the last, I guess it's only been 2 days, which is amazing, but based on the content that we've heard the same thing from Koreans, having the same problem. And I think, you're kind of hearing it a little bit is like, this is what the people want, right? Because they're going to keep coming back. If the channel's changed, right? If the channel's changed, then they're going to, well, what keeps them there? And what keeps them there is the division, or hearing your own voice bounce back to you.
Echo chamber.
Yeah. So to me, I'll just say what I tell my buddies, which is just like, don't watch TV. Because, and no offense to my TV colleagues down there, it's that's the market now, and that's what's rewarded, and for me, I can't see any chance of that ever dissipating. It's only going to get worse.
I'd like to hear from CNN, and I'd also like to suggest to the ambassador that he watch PBS.
Well, the tone often depends on which hours are being viewed. The Eastern Time Zone evening talk shows during the Trump administration did become more political, and they did become more opinionated than they ever have before. But this was a very unique situation. You had the leader of the country lying constantly and, saying that the election was fraudulent when there was absolutely no evidence of that. And I do think that required broadcasters and print journalists to, as they did, rightly so, call him out on the lies. And I can see how that could be interpreted as preachy. But at the same time, part of our job is holding the powerful accountable. And we have been criticized frequently for our coverage of the Trump administration and not giving enough due to the things that might have gone well. But there was a huge credibility crisis with his job performance. And so it puts the news media, I think, in a very difficult position because we tried to tell both sides of the story, but when one side is often outright lying, it makes it hard.
I would push back on that slightly. Our aim really isn't to actually tell both sides of the story. Our aim is to be
to
fair
acknowledge multiple viewpoints.
Yeah,
let me put it that way. When we're talking about Trump.
Dr. Moon.
Jung In-moon, I'm chairman of Sejong Institute. And I was instrumental in arranging this session. And I wish that we have more audience from Jeju. But,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have two major questions and one minor question. One question is this. To what extent American press has impact on American foreign policy making? Let's take an example of Nancy Pelosi, okay? And New York Times, even Times, CNN, and whatever, they were extremely critical of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but she made a visit to Taiwan, That is one good example. Look at all other cases, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever. American government tend to make a lot of mistakes, which Ray Burkhardt may not agree with me, but the press is a very important tool in shaping American foreign policy, but apparently American government is not listening to in the media report. Why is the case? Okay, and that is the first question. And second question is, to what extent Korean issue is...
Can I ask you to just take your mask off while you ask the question?
To what extent the Korean issue constituted the topic for coverage, during the days 2017, North Korean nuclear was a hot topic. Now Ukraine, the Korean issue disappeared. Okay, what is intentional or is it a natural process in the United States? And to what extent, if North Korea undertakes a seventh nuclear testing, do you think that the Korean issue will draw attention in American media? And there's a second question. And third question, I have a very, it's a tiny question, but it could be a very existential question to CNN. Emily, CNN is so widespread in South Korea, even in Europe. Everybody watches CNN International. But my kids live in the United States. They rarely see CNN. They always watch Fox TV. Why there's a huge discrepancy between CNN abroad and CNN at home?
I appreciate that you called it Fox TV and not Fox News. Yeah. No, that is an interesting thing that we run across. TV, cable news has become extremely politicized in the U.S., and people often choose their cable news provider based on their political beliefs. And so, yeah, I mean, you will find it's become a very tense issue almost, like businesses that want to show the news on a TV in a lobby or whatnot. They'll get in trouble if they show CNN, they'll get in trouble if they show Fox. And so a lot of them just put on the Weather Channel. But CNN International overseas, it's very interesting for me to come here and see it's my channel, my employer, on so many TV screens because, first of all, CNN International is not widely available back home. And unless you have a very fancy cable package or pay for an extremely a huge subscription, you don't get our channel very often. And so when I see it all over the place here, it does remind me of the reach, the responsibility, and it also raises questions among us about, how much of the worldview is shaped by what we're putting out there. That, it's an important question that I think perhaps is easy to forget sometimes when we're doing our jobs in Atlanta, Georgia, that sometimes even political decisions could be shaped by our coverage.
I'd like to take the second question. First of all, you don't have to apologize about it not being sparsely populated, standing room only now. With the DPRK. So, yeah, 2017, of course, it was the biggest story. Our president basically threatened the North Koreans with a nuclear strike. Fire and fury. And there was following that, there was a détente in a way that had never happened before. These were monumental historic events that, my children will be reading about. And the fact that, Ukraine has supplanted that story should be no surprise. There are thousands of people, thousands of casualties. There are millions of displaced people. It has all sorts of repercussions for the continent and the world.
Korea.
What's that?
And North Korea right now.
And North Korea right now. Exactly, yeah.
And Taiwan.
So I mean, I know that sometimes it's thought that the media runs all their horses from one thing to another, and to some degree there's some truth to that. But I mean, the most, when it comes to the most pressing story of the times, these things are easily explained. Now, I should also say, North Korea, for somebody like me who covers national security, this is never far from my mind. you know, we are now seeing the worst realizations of the 90s, where, you know, North Korea was embarking on this program, you know, missions sent abroad. Mr. Ambassador could detail this more than I, but, you know, now this is a real thing. And now we're talking about the country having tactical nuclear weapons. And we're having South Korea talk about developing their own deterrent. This is a world that we did not want to live in, and now we must confront. And how this is going to be handled is a real, you know, complex question to answer. And although Americans don't know, or maybe not following that day to day, when the next test goes off, that will be the biggest story. It will supplant Ukraine for, you know, for a sizable amount of time.
I was just going to echo that. For a news organization like the Times, there are various, you know, tension points in the world that even if they're not the main story now, we always have to understand them. We have to be ready for them. North Korea is one of them. Another would be Israel-Palestine. There are a variety of conflicts that it is part of our job to make sure Americans understand why they are important, but also for us to always be ready for that next turn of the screw in terms of what could be coming down the road. And I think that, you know, one of the other points that I was going to make, however, is I've been reflecting a lot since we got to Korea about the fact that so much of our coverage of Korea is about North Korea and that relationship, and particularly national security issues. And, you know, what responsibility do we have to broaden the lens on what Americans understand about South Korea and the Korean Peninsula? And I've kind of felt this a lot in my career because I covered Asia, and I think a lot of American audiences are pretty familiar with Europe. Europe is a place that people travel to pretty frequently, you know, and that there's more attention on, for instance, the British royal family versus Asia. And one of the things that is disheartening to me is as China has increasingly become, you know, seen as an adversary in the United States, and there is the threat of, for instance, war over Taiwan, there's more interest in China and Asia as a whole than there has been in much of my career. And to me, that just makes me wonder about how we should be thinking about coverage and how we can do a better job of making sure that not our only coverage is not about military matters. No offense to my colleagues who cover national security, but trying to broaden that lens for our readers and listeners and watchers.
Before you move, I don't want to ignore your first question, but I wasn't sure I totally understood it.
I think he was asking about the impact of American journalism on foreign policy in the United States, how it shapes it.
Oh, okay.
And I think there are, like, frankly, many, many examples of American journalism dramatically shaping American foreign policy. For instance, the New York Times, our newsroom, won a Pulitzer Prize this year for our coverage of drone strikes, which led to a massive investigation by the Pentagon in terms of civilian casualties. You know, there are a variety of other examples I could cite in that way, but I think there's also, it goes back to my previous comments about political division in the country and the fact that there's not a lot of political incentives for many of our readers, and this is certainly not an American-only phenomenon, to go off message or to reconsider things or to admit that they're wrong about things. And that is particularly true as news media is increasingly not the main source of information for Americans, and really, frankly, across the globe. If you're getting, you know, I have this exercise I often do when I'm in a taxi where I ask the taxi driver, how do you get your news? And they're frequently telling me TikTok or Instagram or some platform, some social media platform. If that hasn't been curated, vetted news source, the level of misinformation out there is very, very high. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of incentives to stick with your guns if you're an American politician right now, or any politician right now, versus trying to actually learn about a situation and grow from it.
We have a couple of questions out there, but first, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just add one thing briefly to the previous conversation that we did have about issues with missiles on the peninsula. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but one thing is that it maybe doesn't generate headlines all around the country, but it hasn't stopped generating headlines for us in Hawaii, and definitely not for our colleagues in Guam and in the Marianas, because it is very much on our minds.
Spencer.
Thank you. I'm Spencer Kim. I'm affiliated with the Pacific Century Institute. Earlier, Dr. Moon mentioned that he was instrumental in having you here. Ambassador Burkhardt, how long has your program, exchange programs, been going on?
This program's been going on since 2005.
So,
and you remember the first year when I brought some Korean journalists to the United States, and Spencer was our organizer of our LA program. He was our, as in his own words, he was our driver, our interpreter, our cook, and arranging meetings with the mayor of LA and all kinds of important people in town, and took us to a Dodgers game as well. So
we haven't gotten that kind of service from you.
The reason I asked that is this. So your program has been going on for 18 years, 17 years?
Yeah, 17.
So what gave you the idea to start this program way back in 17 years ago, that situations were not as bad in those days as described by this 6 journalists? What insight did you have thinking that there will be need for this?
Actually, there was something that was worse those days than it is today, and that was relations between Seoul and Washington. There was a lot of tension, and we felt that this program was a way to at least deal with that in terms of the reporting from both sides and increase the understanding. The 2 administrations at that time, you know, were not in particularly, there were just various tensions and misunderstandings that we thought that this could help to deal with.
So the point I'm making is, as you bring out all these challenges that you face, there has to be a solution by somebody. You know, you suggested freelancing. You know, there could be technical issues, but there has to be
We are very open to suggestions.
There has to be some big thinking and looking at years ahead and committing, sustaining. And after 17 years, I think, we're beginning to see what can happen. So, thank you.
Okay, we'll take that up. We'll keep that, but first we had another question over here.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this panel. I'm Miguel Laplante from the Swiss Embassy. Just a question, His Excellency, I mentioned before the increased polarization of US media. I would be very curious to know, because there's been one major shift, is that you go to digital first, and there's also all this social media where people get information. To what degree does that put pressure to you to get information out quickly and maybe get more shocking news so you get more clicks? I mean, I would be very curious to know that. And my second question is, of course, American media is also the Anglo-Saxon media. It's not the same in media from German-speaking, French-speaking media. You have a big audience around the world. And my question is, to what degree do you bring the news differently to your international audience than to your American audience? Are there any differences in particular global geopolitical news? Thank you.
Good questions. I can see very applicable to some of the CNN and the New York Times and all these people. So who wants to start out?
I mean, the only thing I want to start is I agree that I think our news landscape has become very reactionary, especially with the increase of social media and the democratization of news. And there's been an increase of news that's been inaccurate reported in social media. So there is a problem that we have become more reactionary. I agree on that. And what responsibility, I guess, do we have in vetting that and taking it a little slower to make sure we have the story correctly? Though at the same time, like, are we actually competing against the news that we see on social media? So maybe that's just more of a question for our panel, but that's one topic I thought of with their question.
So many Americans are getting rid of cable, and so I find that we're putting more and more and more on the web, on social media than ever before. And it is vetted. It's often the same thing you're seeing on your TV, but we're offering it free on the website, or you can stream it live on Instagram.
I was just to comment too to your first question specifically, at least from the organization that I work for, the major corporation that owns my newspaper is called Gannett, and I will say that them trying to figure out how to get people to click on our news online and make money from it is a huge emerging priority that I would say is like at the forefront of everything that they're telling us to do now. So we have a growing, group of people called the digital optimization team, and all that they do and then tell us to do is to really see, what people are Googling, what's trending on Facebook, and to craft headlines in a way so that they can get those clicks. Because the reality is, too, that local newspapers particularly haven't figured out, well, they don't make as much money from digital ads than print ads, and so that gap still, there's still a gap, and that's a problem. And so there's a huge focus in that, and I have seen instances where it has, in my opinion, veered more towards a sensational, clickbaity headline that at times may or may not be as helpful, but there's definitely a huge move towards that, at least for local media companies that are really struggling financially.
The digital optimization team sounds like something from a 30-year-old sci-fi movie.
Yeah, they call it the dot. Serious, yeah, so we have dot meetings, and it's yeah.
The future is terrible.
I'm certainly not going to be the person who defends the dot, but I think what you're hearing and what my colleagues are describing right now is an extreme financial stress amongst most of our news organizations in the United States. We're very lucky at the New York Times for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that we have moved to a subscription-based business model. The reason that I'm a big fan of that is because it doesn't put page views, which is one of the metrics that most organizations will use to sell advertising. It puts journalism first, the subscription model. And we have had a lot of success with the subscription model at the Times. We're pretty singular at that right now in terms of being able to finance now a almost 2,000 person newsroom versus local news. They are really, really struggling. They're still very much focused on bringing in advertising. And since the best metric for whether or not to advertising works is a page view, that's an incentive to have something like the digital optimization team. Mm-hmm. That said, one of the things that I often talk to my own colleagues about is the fact that every story you do, you want it to have the largest audience that it possibly can. And so things like digital optimization and SEO, when you're competing for an audience's attention, they can be very, very helpful in making sure people ever even see your journalism. And so that is one of the things that we often talk about in terms of trying to make sure that the headline is at the top. One of the things that most people don't talk about is search engines. For instance, Google, they can determine the fate of a lot of our journalism now, and making sure that people see your work. And so trying to make sure that you are optimizing for those is actually, I would argue, pretty important. in terms of gatekeeping. But I also just, sorry, before I pass over to Bill, I will say the one thing that the Times has that not very many other publications have is we do have an international edition. And you can, well, first of all, we of course have both a Spanish language edition and we have a Mandarin edition. But in addition to that, we are now trying to personalize more and more of our coverage to an international audience as opposed to an American audience. Of course, we are an American news organization. That has not changed, but we are more and more focused as we're programming what, for instance, is on our homepage, thinking about it in an international context as opposed to just an American context.
Time International does the same thing. You know, we front interviews with world leaders. You know, we try to tailor that to the audience that we're in. So, but I'm most interested in this, the SEO and all that. I mean, this is really the dark arts. I mean, we sit here and we talk about it, but we don't really even understand how it works very much in terms of what makes our story go atop the Google News.
The problem is that we actually have no control over, you know, we're basically, whether or not people see our news coverage is often determined by a social media platform, and really, I guess, Google is the largest determinant of that. And so part of running a news organization is having negotiations with Google to make sure that you are favored in the algorithm.
There are whole teams dedicated to that interface in trying to get your story to the top. It's a really, I mean, in that way, this is new, right? Because before we were our own gatekeeper. And you know, you saw Time Magazine, you saw New York Times, you knew that was a credible source, you're going to pull that off the shelf and read it and whatever. Now you type in, you know, something happens in the world, you know, the Hawaii missile warning. You're going to write Hawaii missile warning, and then you're going to click the first thing that's up there. Now, that might be my story, but it's probably not going to be my story. And who knows whose story it is, right? And it could be somebody who's, you know, may or may not even have accurate information. I mean, more times than not, that's not the case, but it's worth ringing that bell. But lastly, I'm sorry. Some of the things that you're talking about, you know, getting to the web first and this has been the lifeblood of the news industry since its inception. You know, you're always wanting to beat the guy to the. I mean, you know.
He's describing culture.
Yeah, yeah. So you want to get, you know, scoops. Obviously, are what. You know, that's what makes the New York Times the behemoth that it is, because it's constantly telling you things that no one else knows.
Yeah, I think signature work is increasingly important. So, for instance, Caitlin's news organization is excellent at investigations and has a long tradition of doing that. And so I can think of a lot of local news organizations, the Indianapolis Star, for instance, that break major stories that everyone in the United States are talking about. And so what we're really describing is how to make sure as large of an audience sees that work, as opposed to its value or its worth.
Yeah, and I just wanted to acknowledge, because I felt like it sounded like I was dunking on the dot, but I want to say what Katie and Bill said too are really, I totally agree, and I think ultimately, you know, it's just a tough balance, and yeah, I think that there's a lot of factors, a lot of considerations, and I think the reality is that people are finding us on these platforms, and you know, we want to stay in business, and we want people to read what we're doing, and so how do we do that and maintain the integrity, you know, and the rigor of what we're doing? And so yeah, it's valid.
I always tell the joke. I went to journalism school at Columbia, and when I became the managing editor at the Boston Globe, which was my last job before I came to the New York Times, I oversaw a team of engineers. And so I had to learn an entirely different language, and I oversaw what we call product and development. You know, in one way, that was a wonderful experience, because we're creating these richer journalistic experiences for our audience through digital design, being able to create interactives, so many different graphics, so many different elements. At the same time, I had never ever had to have a conversation about coding before, about how do you, my favorite story about this was one time our website wasn't working. It was down, and I called the head of engineering, and I was like, the website's down, we have to get it fixed. And he said, okay, we're gonna add it to the 2-week sprint, so hopefully by this date, it'll be fixed. And I was like, no, it needs to be fixed now. And I think that's like an interesting tension that you're seeing increasingly in newsrooms.
I'm beginning to understand why I get 500 articles about Taiwan sent to me every day.
Well, yeah, you read a lot about Taiwan, right?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Kathy?
I had a question, but I think you're running out of time.
No, we have
15 minutes.
15 minutes and 10
sorry.
seconds. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe this time.
Kathy Stevens, former ambassador to Korea and the chair of
also associated with the Pacific Century Institute.
Korea Society and many other organizations.
Yeah, my real question should be, is there a Pacific Century? But but actually, my question is about turning back a little bit. This is a fascinating discussion, by the way, to covering, in particular, Asia. And Kathleen's made some references to the challenges of covering China. I mean, one, it seems to me that over the last 10 years, as under Xi Jinping, as China's place in the world has hardened, as U.S.-China relations have worsened, that whatever cable you listen to or media pick up, there's a very tough tone on China, right? At the same time, I don't think there are many foreign correspondents who are able to report out of China. I just would be interested in, one, your comments about the challenges of covering China and U.S.-China relations. It's clearly a very important story, and I think most Americans understand that. But secondly, in getting to some of the points you've made so well about relating that to local concerns, what we've also had over the last couple of years is a rise, I mean, the first in my lifetime, in real anti-Asian sentiment in many, many communities, maybe across the United States. And I just wonder what the challenges as journalists, wherever you are, of trying to track this story in all of its many, many dimensions.
Do you want to talk about it, Brittany?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to your point about the anti-Asian sentiment and how that's affected our news coverage. I as a Chinese American, I covered the pandemic and worked at NBC News, and it's hard to kind of be part of the story as well as covering the story, because there was a lot of vitriol against the community I'm a part of when it came to COVID and China-U.S. relations. I don't have as much experience as Kathleen covering China-U.S. relations, but I can speak that it was challenging, but also like, when I was saying earlier, the lack of diversity in newsrooms, I was one of the few Chinese Americans there who can speak to these issues, and it was hard because my colleagues could not relate as much. And that led to biased coverage. That led to, I think, some cultural insensitivities in some of the journalism. So that's to your point about that. I don't know if you want to speak more to the U.S.-China relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I became very, very fascinated with China when I was a high school junior, so many, many years ago at this point. And I began learning Mandarin, and at the time, which was, the early aughts, that was seen as a very extremely valuable skill to have in the United States. And you had all these stories of parents teaching their children Mandarin. This really kind of went through, the early 2000s, and then you had something shift a little bit. And, I think that there's less interest in that and more interest in China as an adversary. And I think that the pandemic was a fascinating story to cover from that perspective, in that you had this challenge as a journalist to be both explaining why we should be thinking about China in terms of the security challenges there, but also we have an extremely interconnected relationship with China, right? Like, yes, the COVID began in China. At the same time, we are so reliant on China for supply chain issues that I think it was one of the first times that Americans really opened their eyes to that fact, and the fact that we were producing so many American goods, so many essential American goods in China. And so how you balance, particularly in your coverage, making sure people understand those kind of nuances, I think is a really, really important role for us to play and important questions for us to be asking, particularly as we we see China, become our dominant, I don't really know how to say it, but like our main adversary, right?
The Pentagon calls it the near peer.
Yeah, the near peer, exactly.
Yeah, and to your point, while the president was out there talking about the China virus, I was working with Operation Warp Speed, which was a military-run operation to get not only the vaccine, but all the the accoutrement that comes with that for swabs and one of the things that the military officers were telling me is that they were having problems getting syringes, and they had a contract with a Chinese company to get millions and millions of these syringes, probably the ones that were in our arms when we got the vaccine, if you get the vaccine. Came from China. That sort of dichotomy of our president castigating them and then us being wholly reliant upon them. It was a unique thing. But there's another part of this, right? Because it's like for us as journalists, China is not. It's not conducive to report. I mean, I can't speak to this personally, but I know that colleagues have had real big problems reporting. I mean, this has always been a problem, but it's come to a head recently. The Wall Street Journal probably being the most well-known case of reporters doing what reporters do, and the government not being happy with that. Now that shades the way that they're going to be covered, right? And if every time I went into a room in the Pentagon, they said, no, we're not going to allow you to write about that, or we did like the way, I'm going to keep going after that.
Yeah, I haven't been able to get a visa. I have an annual ritual in which I try to get a visa to China, and I haven't been able to get one since 2014. It's extremely hard to get a journalistic visa to go into China, and I think one of the things that you've seen both under Xi, but also particularly as the pandemic has played out, is China is becoming increasingly isolated, and that is in part because they've expelled foreign journalists, of course. It's also, of course, the zero COVID policy that reinforces that. But it's one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of what future diplomacy looks like with China, and the fact that you don't have as many Chinese tourists coming to the United States, if at all, or Europe, or so many other parts of the world. When I lived in Shanghai, I remember so clearly in 2006, there was, I would go back to the States, and there would be so many Chinese tourists, and they were constantly, there, and that shift where Chinese citizens had access to the United States and the broader world has changed so much, and there's so much more. They're so much more insular looking that I think it's a pretty troubling trend.
I know we're running out of time. I'm James Kim Russell from the New Zealand Embassy. I'm posted here in Seoul. I'm just interested in what you think is how the American audience views the issue of China's rise, and particularly over the last 5 years, China becoming much more assertive in the way it pursues its goals. The question I have is, do you think that the American audience sees China's rise and that change in assertiveness has primarily been because of Xi Jinping, or do you think of it as being, they see it as more of like a long-term historical trend that's based on culture and history?
I would say I don't think most Americans know enough to have thought that deeply about that particularly, but I would say that I think it's probably a mixture, me personally. I think for a lot of Americans, this is something that does feel a little bit more recent. I do think that it is an issue that Americans are engaged with. I think it's something that they do want to know more about. It is our job to kind of give them that historical context. But in terms of what Americans think, I think we're lucky if Americans know that Xi Jinping is the president of China. That's just.
I would say actually though, with some exceptions, right? So
Sure.
I spend a lot of time. My family is from Wisconsin, the state that Caitlin is from, and the farmers in the Midwest know a lot about China, and they want to understand China. They want to understand their trade policies. They want to understand their copyright laws. They want to, and I think you could go through the line. It goes back to a major theme of this conversation, which is so many people care about the individual issues that really touch their, checking accounts, their families, that they want the relevance to their own personal lives is how they learn about different places and different issues in a really important way, because you could talk about the farmers, but you could also talk about the automakers, right? You could talk about, frankly, if you look at the last 30 years of the United States, globalization, starting under probably the first Bush administration, but really very, very intensely under the Clinton administration, globalization has transformed the American economy. And so, if you talk to a former factory worker in Wisconsin, they'll know all about why Mexico has been able to attract their plant, where their jobs have gone in a way that will not have the historical context that you're describing, but I think is ultimately, a form of information about the international context that we're not giving enough credit to.
We have 4 minutes and 9 seconds left. Let's go down.
I was just going to add real quick just to that point that I do think that then the concerns and interests that the U.S. public has on that, then it's like the the dynamics that Katie was just describing to what U.S. policy is, like, U.S. trade policy or what's happening, politically, domestically, rather than really, I think, understanding what China is doing or what their leader has done to create that rise. It's more like, what has American trade policy or foreign policy done to enable that to happen? And that's where I think they lay blame or they have praise.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think especially in the context of China right now, because there are so much tension. I don't think many Americans really understand the effort that China has gone to across the globe to assert its influence. You look at, for instance, China's approach to Africa and building relationships there, the soft power that is, used on that continent. I don't think people quite grasp that element of it, and again, I think Bill or Kevin could speak to this more. Now, what the narrative is from many politicians in the United States is seeing China as a potential military threat, and so we're once again talking about China, but we're not talking about it in all this nuance that everyone on this panel is describing. We're instead talking about it about how cyber threats or the Taiwan issue, it's much more aggressive, and Americans are reactive by nature that, look at so many elements. Sorry, I'm talking to myself.
CNN looks poised to
Yeah. Please, thank you, Ray.
No, I was not going to weigh in on this one anyway.
Yeah.
Kevin, you had some final thoughts? Anybody else final thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I guess I'll just kind of echo what we were just saying is that, I think Americans just don't understand China in a way that they need to. I think Americans probably don't have any idea what the century of humiliation is. I don't think they really have a grasp of the history in the way that they probably ought to understand why China thinks the way that it does, or even understanding the broader idea of a Chinese-speaking world that isn't just the Chinese state. I think about these things because my godparents are Chinese, and also I live right by Honolulu, Chinatown. But that's kind of why I'm more connected to these issues. But I don't know how much all Americans are, but Americans definitely are thinking about China, and it is something that is on their mind.
I would just say, what's that?
I'm needed in Honolulu.
I think he's in the right place. Our the Indo-Pacific Command is there. It's a very critical place in terms of policy. I would say on just to put for the first time a personal element into this on Taiwan policy, Taiwan issues that I'm deeply involved in and follow carefully. The level of sort of knowledge behind the questions that people have been putting to me in the last year or so, in all different contexts, is way up. People are paying attention to the issue. They are, they know it's important, and it's in some ways sort of has been encouraging to see this increased level of sort of self-education by a broad range of people on the issue. So I'm into countdown here. And so thank you very much. I appreciate the audience's very good participation. And thank you to the panel. That was actually a terrific conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.